Well, I hate to disappoint the audience, but if I read the entire story, then we're not going to have any time for my fine colleagues. So I will read what is basically the first half of the story, and if you want to find out what happens, buy the book. The title is The Self-Seeding Sycamore. Jeanette had no idea that plants could engender so much hatred. For years she'd left the garden to Wyndham. Weekends outdoors provided an antidote to the windowless stasis of his lab. Though their plot was sizable only by London standards, she'd humored him. Whatever was there to do? A little watering during dry spells, a 10-minute run of the hand mower round the lawn. Having begrudged the dear man neither his solitude nor his superfluous pottering, she treasured snapshots of her husband in muddied khaki trousers, bent over a bed, doing heaven knew what, with a characteristically intent expression. Now, of course, she knew exactly what he'd been doing. How much he'd spared her. While still cosseted by mutual spousal existence, she'd scanned with indifference bitter first-person articles about how fiercely people avoid the bereaved, a revelation her own friends had amply illustrated for a year or more. She didn't blame them. Unintentionally, she and Wyndham had fallen into the heedlessly hermetic unit of two that's so off-putting from the outside. If she didn't need friends then, she'd no right to demand their solicitations now. Besides, she'd grown less compelling to herself. A widow of 57 had both too much story left and not enough. It was narratively awkward, an ellipsis of perhaps 30 years, during which nothing big would happen. Only little things, most of them crap. The big story that was over wasn't interesting either. Pancreatic, swift and dreadful. Yet the pro forma tale did include one poignant detail. 2 years ago, she and Wyndham took early retirement. He from private biochemical research, she from her job as a buyer for Debenhams. Some colleagues had quietly disapproved, and soon no one would be allowed to stop working at 55. But to Jeanette and Wyndham, that argued for a leap through the closing window. They'd not found each other until their 40s, and had made extravagant travel plans for while they were still in rude health. The reasoning was sound, the arithmetic not. The diagnosis arrived a mere 10 weeks after Wyndham's farewell party. She hadn't kept track of whether 57 was the new 47 or 35 or 64, but in any event, whatever age she'd reached was not the age she was. Not long ago, she and Wyndham had mourned every strand that clogged the plug hole, each new crease in her neck when she glanced down. Now, she could not get older fast enough. Convinced that a garden took care of itself, it grew, bloomed, browned, and without prodding renewed the cycle. Other than hiring a boy to mow, for the year following Wyndham's death, Jeanette left the back to its own devices. In truth, she missed the sharpness of those first few months, whose high drama would have been impossible to maintain without it sliding into a humiliating fakery, a performance for herself. While still free-flowing and unforced, the grief had been so immersive, so rich and pure and concentrated, with the opacity of Cabernet, that it verged on pleasure. Yet from the start, the anguish had been spiked with an awful foreknowledge that the keenness of her loss would blunt, leading to a second loss, a loss of loss, some Soft, muffled bufferedness was bound to take over, as if she were buttressed by excess packaging. Unlike the searing period, with its skipped meals and feverish lie-ins, a bufferedness could last forever, and probably would. Sure enough, the stab ebbed to ache. A torturous residual presence gave way to absence. Jeanette took refuge in self-sufficiency. She would take nothing and expect nothing. There must have been millions of such Britons, perfectly neutral social quantities, mutely shopping and tidying up. She would take care of herself, as the garden did. So late this April, she was surprised to note on an aimless stroll beyond the slug-trailed patio, simply to escape the house, which had never felt suffocating when she shared it, that flowering shrubs past their prime were pooping mounds of rotting pink blossoms, under which matted grass skulked, dying or dead, a urinary yellow. Ineffectually, she raked the piles of petals with her fingers off the moribund lawn, in idle amazement that flowers could kill. The silky mulch had a nice heavy wetness, reminiscent of her cheeks after an inadvisable third glass of wine. Its original perfume mixed with an aroma deader and flatter, like sweet but fading memories intermingling with her present self-sufficiency. She surveyed the beds on either side. Pooping flowers were the least of it. Unafflicted by Wyndham's superfluous attentions, the ceanothus had bushed out in scraggly extrusions like an unbarbered afro, blocking the stone path to the toolshed and poking her in the eye. Ivy had choked the herbs, the ferns drooped with snails. The lawn had bare patches from peeing foxes, vermin she'd been too apathetic to shoo. She couldn't speak for the human sphere, but apparently in the botanical world, without the constant intercession of a benevolent higher power, evil triumphed. At first anxious about uprooting her husband's beloved something or others, Jeanette soon mastered the gardener's rubric. Anything that grows fast and well is malevolent. There are gardeners in this audience. She came to match each invader with a uniquely flavored dislike. Burrowing into the mortar of the property line's brick wall, a pretend attractive plant with small, devious leaves inspired an impatient disgust, especially when she failed to rip out the root system. The crafty, low-lying wallflower would be back in a week. Allowed in the passivity of her grieving to rise 6 feet high, a gangling daisy-like species with disproportionately small, stupid yellow flowers had spread thick white ropes of lateral roots so quickly and so thickly that in another month's time the towering, insipid plants would have taken over the world. This aversion was laced with fear. She pursued their extermination with the grim, stoical thoroughness of genocide. Indeed, through late-life gardening, she discovered in herself a murderous side. In this laying of waste, the institution of her private scorched earth policy, she came closer than she had in 17 months to joy. Yet Jeanette reserved her most extravagant loathing for clusters of innocent-looking seedlings that seemed to erupt in concert on a single day, as if obeying a battle plan. Oh, on its own, a single sample of this anonymous item seemed innocuous and easily vanquished. A mere 3 inches high, 2 bright never-mind-me leaves splayed on a spindly stem. But when snatched from the ground, lo, the tiny flagpole had sunk into her property a good 4 inches below, and virtually overnight. Besides which, any organism in sufficient quantity is gross. Bulging clusters of these seedlings, pushing against one another in their blind, ignorant bunching, sprouted en masse through the bark cover around the tool shed. The impertinent would-be trees cropped up in the lightless murk below the shrubs. They perforated the lawn every 2 inches. They penetrated the ivy that had killed the chives, and they threatened the ivy too. Thus by May, her every hour in the garden was devoted to stripping out mocking bouquets that foisted themselves around the trunk of the wisteria, squeezed between the slats of the compost box, and prized the tool shed's baseboards from its frame. Daily, she massacred seedlings by the thousands, creating whole burial mounds of the shriveled fallen, and still they came. The slaughter recalled a certain kind of asymmetrical warfare, whereby a better supplied, more technologically sophisticated army is overrun by forces in rags with sticks. The adversary's greatest weapon, its leadership's utter obliviousness to casualties on a staggering scale. Any child soldier she failed to slay right away would stake a territorial claim. Within days, an overlooked seedling jagged out in aggressive, multi-pronged foliage with the rough nap and variegation of real tree leaves. The fragile stem woodened to a sturdy stalk, the taproot plummeted and grew clinging hairs. Her attempts at jerking these interlopers from the ground were no more effective than the Home Office's feeble efforts to deport asylum seekers. No mystery the source of the assault. On the opposite side of the party wall, a monster of a tree rose 3 stories high, its trunk only a few inches from the brick, ensuring that nearly half its branches extended over her own garden. It was a charmless thing, blocking light from the herb bed, and already grown pregnant with more seed pods, its branches sagging from the weight of their great ghastly clumps. So eclipsing did her antipathy for this verdant vandal grow that she failed to note this was more than she had felt towards any living thing, one way or another, since Wyndham's flatline. A vastly more beguiling tree, the flaming Japanese maple, was growing inexplicably lifeless, so Jeanette booked an appointment with a tree surgeon. He wasn't much comfort. "The poor tree's time has come, missus." But so long as he was at hand, she pointed to the ogre overhead, obnoxiously thriving. "Speaking of trees whose time ought to have come," she said. "What's that?" The surgeon grinned. "A self-seeding sycamore." The name rang a bell. Wyndham must have mumbled it once or twice. It pained her that her patient husband had eradicated 500,000 seedlings every spring with so little complaint. What other suffering had he disguised, especially in those last months? "A volunteer," he went on. "Nobody plants a self-seeding sycamore on purpose. It's a pest tree." He looked it up and down, as if measuring it for a coffin. $3.50, and I'll cut it down for you." The house on her eastern side was owned by a man she gathered from misdelivered post was called Bert Cuss. It was an ugly name, like a 1-2 punch. Perhaps also in his 50s, he had a hulking, furious bearing, and either he seldom left the house, or for extended periods he wasn't there. Sightings were rare. In all seasons, she'd only spotted him in a black crewneck tee, black jeans, neo-Nazi boots, and a buzz cut. She'd never spoken to him, which should have been unusual, but in London wasn't. She and Wyndham had speculated about their neighbor, as one does. Given the biceps and hard stomach, her husband assessed the man as ex-army. Jeanette surmised he was divorced. Soon after Bert moved in, he'd burned a pile of papers out the back, in which she'd spied photographs. Irrationally, she was a little afraid of him. If only because they hadn't spoken. She rushed inside in the uncommon instance that he ventured into his own garden, if you could call it that. For Bert's garden was subject to near total neglect. Yet now that she'd seized on the tree surgeon's offer to be spared that malignancy of seedlings every spring, $3.50 was a bargain. Suddenly her neighbor's obliviousness to horticulture seemed a stroke of good fortune. It felt odd to knock formally on the front door when she gawked daily at her neighbor's unkempt inner sanctum. The peephole cover swung. Multiple locks. "Right," he said gruffly, in the usual uniform. Up close, his eyes were green. "I'm sorry. We've never been—" "You're in 92, he cut her off, jerking his head toward her house. "But, of course, while you're supposing about neighbors, they're supposing about you." "Jeanette Dixon." He nodded curtly, keeping his own name to himself. "I was hoping we might talk about your tree." "What about it?" It was astonishing Bert was even aware of having a tree. "I hate it." "What'd that tree ever do to you?" "More than you'd expect," she said. "It's seedlings. They erupt by the thousands. I spend hours and hours pulling them up." "Sounds terrible," he said, and the deadpan grated. "I now have a feel for the experience of being taken over by aliens." "The point is," she said, "I'd be willing to pay to have it cut down." "Sounds a bother. What's in it for me?" "You must have at least as bad a problem with seedlings yourself." "Problem I ain't even noticed can't be much of a problem." "Well, we'd both have more light, and your own, garden would feel larger and more open." It was the best she could do on the spot. "No sale. Rather have my privacy." She was getting flustered. He stood before her too squarely, blocking the door in an unfriendly fashion, arms folded, forearms rippling. The t-shirt was tight, his pectorals formidable. She wondered how a man who seemed rarely to go outdoors had got that tan. He was a brute, monosyllabic and sullen, and nothing like Wyndham. "My tree surgeon says that no one would deliberately plant such a pest tree." "Your tree surgeon?" "Why's that funny?" "I don't even have a GP." "What I meant was, that's the opinion of an expert." "Darlin'," Bert said, "I've been through this rigmarole before, and you got your answer. Ask your husband." So, Wyndham had tried to negotiate this very solution, to no avail. "I'm afraid my husband passed away 18 months ago. Ergo, here I am, still grieving, and I'm spending all my time ripping up your flipping seedlings." But Bert didn't embarrass easily. "Tough luck," he said dispassionately. "Could you at least consider my proposal? I'd make all the arrangements, please, as a favor. It would mean so much to me." "Lady, I spent 17 years doing favors for a bird not so different from yourself, and in the end it didn't mean nothing to her at all." He shut the door in her face. Confirmation. Divorced.
It's lovely to be here. I want to say a few words about not so much the subject of the story, but the style and the language, if I may. I'm very interested in multiple different forms of storytelling, oral storytelling and the written form, and sometimes the difference between the two. And I do write in English and in Turkish. Over the years, I realized if there's humor, satire, irony, particularly irony in my work, in the story I want to convey, I much prefer to do this in English. And if there's sorrow, sadness, longing, melancholy, I think it's much easier in Turkish. And I've often wondered about this, more than a linguistic difference. It's a cultural difference, I think. But I believe I'm much more interested in the commute between the two languages, you know, the back and forth, in being more nomadic, if I may, intellectually. And I am interested in migrating birds, people who are traveling and who feel they have multiple belongings. So this story is about a migrating bird. Winter in this forsaken town carries itself like a sultan, ceremonious and controlled, sending envoys of howling winds and messengers of thunderstorms weeks before to let everyone know that it will be arriving soon. Not this year, though. This time, winter descends in a day, if not in a couple of hours, as if determined to catch us unawares. Early in the morning, we wake up to a piercing chill, and by midday, entire streets are canopied by a white mantle. In the afternoon, the snow, no longer falling in soft flakes, comes down in thick flurries. Those of us who have been able to get to the university now realize that we are trapped on campus until the roads are opened again. My feet crunching in the snow, my boots as heavy as the sand buckets used for fire protection, I make my way to the canteen frequented by students, staff, and assistants. I'm surprised to find it filled to capacity. It seems as if everyone thinks this will be the best location to wait in until the weather calms down. There, at a corner table, I see a stranger occupying my usual seat, invading my space, surrounded by my friends. The first thing I notice about him is his hair. Brittle, wavy, a blonde so pale that in the anemic light from the window it appears almost silver. Amidst people who all have skin and hair of different shades of brown, he looks like a drawing in a coloring book that a child has forgotten to fill in. As I approach the group, the stranger leans over a notebook and says something that I cannot catch over the noise. My friends clap and laugh. By the time I reach them, the laughter subsides, though their faces are still beaming. "Ayla, come and join us. We have a visitor. He is learning Turkish," says Yasemin, whom I have known since first grade. Why an outsider would move to a place everyone is trying to get away from is a mystery to me. Well, maybe not everybody is eager to leave. I certainly am. Ours is not a fabulous university. Not even the dean cares to pretend otherwise. I cannot help but suspect that while I'm wasting time here, my real life awaits elsewhere. The visitor, having turned towards me, says with an audible accent, says in Turkish, "Merhaba, benim adım Gerard. Senin adın ne?" My friends chuckle. We adore it when foreigners bend over backwards to utter a few words in Turkish. We will do anything to assure them they're speaking beautifully, even when we don't understand a word they say. Except I am not smiling. Gerard has extended his hand towards me, waiting. I don't shake hands with men. My family is religious, very religious. Since the age of 11, long before I started bleeding, I have worn a headscarf tied tightly under my chin, a detail impossible for anyone not to see, and yet somehow Gerard has missed the message. Still, I nod politely in a clumsy attempt not to offend him. Realizing his mistake, he pulls his hand back. A shade of pink creeps up his cheeks, which are spattered with freckles like the cinnamon powder we sprinkle on hot milk on such bleak days as this. I have never seen a man blush before, and that, more than anything, endears him to me, his vulnerability. To make it up to him, I smile and say my name, Ayla. Ayla, he repeats in an anxious echo. I sit with the rest of the group, careful to stay on the fringes, looking sidelong at this Gerard. Everything about him is pale, his skin, his knuckles, his grey-green eyes speckled with hints of amber. He's simply too light for this part of the world. Strangely, he invokes in me a desire to protect him, though from what or whom I cannot tell. When I was a little girl, My mother, determined to cheer me up after I had my tonsils removed, gave me a chick that had just hatched. All day I held the dainty creature between my palms, too terrified to move, listening to its tiniest of hearts drum in its chest. I lived with an intense fear that a cat might swallow it or someone would sit on it. So profound was my terror that in the end the chick had to be taken away from me. This pale foreigner reminds me of that yellow ball of down. I want to cup my hands around him without touching, just to make sure he's safe. The next day, the snow already turned into a muddy slush. Yasemin finds me after the first class. "What do you think is the Dutchman's real aim?" she says, displaying the mistrust she feels towards people she does not share the same surname or roots with. Well, he told us it's an EU-supported program. He's an exchange student. Yeah, I bet, Yasemin clucks her tongue. The EU doesn't want to let Turkey in, so why would they send their students over? Aren't you exaggerating, I ask. Oblivious to my objection, she carries on. Did it ever occur to you he could be a missionary? I pose. You think? She nods fiercely. Once again, with that same childhood trepidation of being unable to protect the fragile, I try to say something in his defense. Well, he's clearly into languages. He's going to be a linguist. Yasemin scrunches her nose in disbelief. Or maybe he's a spy. What would a spy do in this town? I protest. You never know, she says, and repeats in hearty agreement with herself. You never know. Then we both fall quiet because we see Gerard sitting alone on a bench. When he catches sight of me, he raises his arms in the air, as if I have pulled a gun on him. I understand. He's not going to try to shake my hand ever again. Now it's my turn to blush. Slowly, Gerard and I begin to talk, to get to know each other. I start to look forward to seeing him again each morning. Yasemin, whose eyes are as sharp as a hawk's and whose temperament is no less fierce, warns me. What are you doing, Ayla? Have you lost your senses? Why, he's my friend, I say, and you've got a dirty mind. He's a man, Ayla, a non-Muslim man, to boot. People will talk. Your father... She doesn't need to complete the sentence. She can just leave it like that, as though it were an unwrapped candy no one wanted to taste. There's nothing to worry about, I say firmly. I know myself, okay? Yasemin shrugs, a gesture to make it clear that were I to tumble down someday, she won't be the one lifting me up. Later in the semester, when we have become good friends, Gerard makes me promise I will always correct the mistakes he makes in Turkish. Don't be too kind, otherwise how can I improve myself, he says. So under that easily bruised skin and blushing face of his, he hides a strange confidence, like an underground city within a city. One lunch break, he and I reminisce enthusiastically about the day we first met, weeks ago, the snow, the cold, the canteen. I explained to him how his hair was the first thing I saw, a roiling of silvery foam over a dark sea of bodies. Laughing, he says his hair is yet another thing he inherited from his mother, alongside his bad teeth, poor eyesight, and incurable sentimentality. Whereas when I first saw you, Gerard adds, I mistook you for an angry soul. Why would you think that? You were frowning a lot. Angry people scare me. His words, so unexpected and so sincere, shake me to the core. Seeing the change in my expression, he pulls his chair closer to offer sympathy, careful not to touch me. But then I got to know you better, and I understood how flawed my first impression was. We sit in silence for a while. I cannot bring myself to tell him that I know a lot about angry souls, as my father happens to be one of them. Baba was a difficult, quarrelsome man back when he used to frequent clubs of ill repute, tales of which reached our ears, though we feigned ignorance. And he remained just as angry after he repented of his ways and turned to Islam. With or without God, he is always incensed. As if he reads my thoughts, Gerard asks me about my family, my parents in particular. He questions me about faith and God, and gingerly, as though treading in murky waters, afraid of saying the wrong thing or making the wrong move, but unable to resist the temptation to proceed just the same. Such is his timid insistence that I find myself revealing things I never thought I would share with another person, least of all a stranger. Grandma is the most pious person under our roof, yet the way she lives her faith is very different from my Baba's. I start telling her about Gerard, little by little, so urgent is my need to open up to someone. Don't bind your heart, my lamb, Grandma says. Why? Because he's a Christian? No, because he's a migrating bird, Grandma says. Here today, gone tomorrow. Spotting in her words a thread of hope, I cling to it. But you don't mind that he comes from another religion, do you? I mean, if he's serious, he could always convert to Islam, no? A look of dismay crosses her face. Your father won't like such talk. But you're older, Grandma. You're his mother. He should listen to you. If you talk to him... Grandma's smile doesn't reach her eyes. Only Allah can soften your father's heart. And he will. We just don't know when. Until that day comes, we must wait and pray and not do anything to make his blood boil. Even though it's spring, there's a creeping chill in the air. I shudder as if it were I with old bones. The next morning, I try to give Gerard a wide berth, but it doesn't work. Before the afternoon is over, we're talking and laughing together again. People look at us, a blonde European and a headscarved girl walking side by side in this small Anatolian town. This is surely not a sight to miss. At nights, in the bedroom I share with my sister Fatma, I rack my brains to find reasons not to like Gerard. He has a funny way of sucking his teeth after he has eaten lunch, which, if I put my mind to it, I know I can find annoying. His skin reminds me of a fence badly in need of a fresh coat of paint. Those freckles, I tell myself, must continue all the way down to his arms, his back. The thought of this, however, rather than being off-putting, proves to be arousing. It dawns on me that I have been trying to picture him naked. If we ever get married, what will our children look like, I wonder? Will they have my dark eyes or his fair hair? Maybe we will go and settle down in Holland, though preferably in a Muslim neighborhood. Gerard by then will have to become a Muslim, of course. He will have to change his name, I'm sure. Fatma has found out. She must have gone through my notebooks. Father will kill you, she says. I rip out all the pages with his name written on it. I destroy the mementos he has given me, silly little presents, and the notes and letters and drawings with his diligent handwriting. I find out that it's possible to erase months in the scope of an hour. Gerard needs to go home for Easter. Last winter, he was disappointed not to see any Christmas decorations around. He tells me about Easter customs, chocolate eggs delivered by the Dutch Easter hare, though carefully avoids any talk of his prophet or of his holy book. I listen to everything he says, and I also listen to his silences. Before he leaves, he gives me a book, The Beloved by Khalil Gibran. I have the exact copy, he says. If we read the same book at the same time, we'll still be connected. And then when we meet again, we can talk about the expert. I correct his Turkish experience. A loving expression flits across his face, though he holds himself ramrod straight. I look around. There's no one down the corridors. I kiss him on each cheek to say goodbye. Freckles of fire burn my lips. I was not yet 7 when Baba, after squandering all our money with a woman of the night and being beaten by the bodyguards of the club she worked at, saw the error of his ways and decided to devote the rest of his days to balancing out all the sins he had heretofore accumulated. First, the ashtrays in the house disappeared. Then the empty wine bottles we piled under the sink and sold to gypsy boys over the weekends. Mother was thrilled. No more smells of tobacco, no more smells of alcohol and cheap perfume, no more dried vomit to wash off the clothes, no more disdainful looks from the neighbors. Soon after, when I returned home from school, instead of the TV set inside the cabinet, I found a glass vase with plastic roses. "Where's the TV?" I asked, trying not to let my panic show. There was a program I was keen not to miss. I had promised a friend who had gone to visit her grandparents that I would watch it and bring her up to speed on it afterwards. Mother stared at me as if she didn't know what I was talking about. "Your father gave it away." "When will he get it back?" I said. "We do not need a TV," Mother said in the quietest of voices. I cried. I kicked the vase. I raised as much noise as I could. But when Baba came home in the evening, I was a mouse. Fatma and Mother, tired of listening to my objections all day, exchanged glances. They knew I would never dare to rise up against Baba, nor would they. Whatever spell of insanity or burst of rebellion, we made sure it would not reach Baba's ears. He never beat us. At no stage in my life did I remember him hitting anyone, but we were terrified of him. He had a way of looking at you, looking through you, his gaze sharp and formidable enough to make you weep, and if he gave you an earful in this state, it was not words that spilled from his lips, but arrows of pain and bolts of rage. Mother was the most frightened of him, and her fear, like a contagious virus, had passed on to us, children. So following Friday prayers, Mother, her hair escaping from its pins, pulls me aside. Her grasp on my arm is so tight it hurts. Fatma must have told her, "You want everyone to spit in our face? Have you no shame?" I have nothing to hide. I love Gerard, and even though he has yet to express this, I'm sure he loves me too. He wants to marry me, I say all of a sudden. He will convert to Islam, I'm sure. Right now, truth is not as important as courage, so I can lie. Mother opens and closes her mouth, at a loss for words. "You will stop this minute, you hear me? Or else your father will kill you, and he will kill me too." That same night, I sleep fitfully, but roam around inside a placid dream. There's a man beside me. I don't need to look at him to know he's Gerard. We're in a strange place, not a church, not a mosque, but some other sacred space. He's holding my hand. I notice his fingers are covered in warts, and I flinch. "But how can we be together if you don't like me?" he says. Only then do I see what I'm wearing, a long, pearly gown. We're getting married. In the morning, I wake to a lightness of heart and the clarity of mind. I'm going to talk to Baba. But first, I will explain everything to Gerard. We don't have a computer at home. I use one at the university to write him an email. Having no experience with boys, I don't know what to say. After much hesitation, I tell him that I love him, and I believe he loves me too, that upon his return he must convert to Islam. While this might sound frightening, he will be happy in this world and possibly the next world too. Every day for the rest of the week, I check to see if there's an answer. Finally, a message pops up in my email box. Words from a lost language. He says there's a misunderstanding, and if he's played any role in this, he's truly sorry. He says he has a girlfriend, and marriage is the last thing on his mind, let alone conversion. He says he's happy to be who he is. He won't be coming back, for he has received a fellowship elsewhere. He will never forget his time in Turkey and will always remember me fondly. These days, I do not go to the canteen. I avoid Yasemin, from whom I cannot bear to hear another "I told you so." Like a shutter in a rainstorm, banging against a window, I venture forth, retreat back, try afresh, retreat again. Nothing changes in my life, and yet nothing is the same.
I was billed as a Bronte lover, and that is true. From a young age I've loved the Brontes, but I'm an heretical Bronte lover because I don't much like Jane Eyre. I don't much like the book, and I don't much like the heroine. And one of the reasons I don't like it is for this iconic statement she makes, "Reader, I married him." It seems to me a smug remark, and I don't like that the love of her life, Mr. Rochester, has to be maimed and cut down to size before she can marry him. So I conceived the idea when I was offered the chance of writing for a collection entitled Reader, I Married Him, that I would write from Edward Rochester's point of view. And the story is called Reader, She Married Me. It was simply joy at first. So often it is joy at first, wouldn't you say? It is the at last we should judge our human dealings by. Yet who but the great judge is able to do that? I do not speak here of God, for about him I remain a cautious sceptic. No, it is that other exigent, imponderable death, towards whose kingdom I, Edward Rochester, draw daily closer, whose judgment I am most disposed to trust now. During those long months when I searched vainly for Jane, I rehearsed all the blessed times we had spent together. Our first meeting, that chilly winter afternoon, when unaware of my identity, she aided me with the injury sustained from my fall, and I teased her that she had bewitched my horse. The time she came in search of me, braving the wind and rain, and on finding me flew like a bird to my glad arms. The many times I found her sitting with that indefatigable knitter, good old Mrs. Fairfax, a book in her hands, and that little burr, Adele, my foster child, idly content at her knee. Most speakingly, the recollection of her at the wicket gate, standing beside me in the plain square of blonde she had fashioned herself for a bridal veil, when, caught by some impalpable intimation of the coming doom, I delayed our entry into the church, and threaded through them all the luminous aura of elfishness which had so enchanted me. From our first encounter, she provoked in me thoughts of other worlds. And there were few nights that passed unmolested by stricken consideration of what I might have done differently to avoid that terrible moment of revelation in the church, the shocking breach in the sacrament, the unlooked-for response to the solemn words. I would give half my life to undo that moment now. And then the recollections of that night of the final immolation, Thornfield Hall, wrecked in a fire which had its own grim fitness. I have told Jane I had thought I had lost her for good, along with everything else. What I could not tell her, then or now, was that together with the knowledge came a sharp sense of relief. The ruining of those ill-starred prospects was a kind of comfort. It had always been perilously thin ice I was treading. If you were to ask her, she would say that after the calamity I preferred a life of utter loneliness, that I had hated to be helped in my blindness, that I did not like to put my one sound hand into that of any hirelings, and it was only her arrival that induced me to be led back to a semblance of common humanity. I own it was heaven to crush in my own surviving poor her child's hand. I never in my life saw such small hands. And when she came to me then, she was tender, oh, so tender. Let me try to put down as best I can what occurred that night when Thornfield burned. When, having found my wife's quarters empty, I fought my way up to the roof and saw her tall silhouette against the green and amber-streaked sky. All knowledge that the flame she had started posed a mortal danger evaporated. Suddenly, all that was present to me was the two of us, facing the people we had become on the very threshold of eternity. She stood there in her white gown, upright and still, on the edge of the battlements. "Bertha," I called. "Bertha, my dear," and I believe, certainly I pray, that she will have heard none of the old harshness and revulsion in my tone, for I felt nothing at that moment but supreme remorse. She looked so lost, so bewildered, so childlike in her white gown, and the eyes she turned upon me that I had once admired were not those of a raving woman, but the anguished eyes of a cornered animal. She took a step towards me, her feet pitifully bare, and I saw that she was holding something out, as if it were an offering or a gift. I likewise took a tentative step, mindful that should she take fright and step backwards, she might fall, but she stood stock still, seeming to wait for me. I should have known what it was she wanted to show me. A coral, the kind that is given to young babies to jingle and cut their teeth on. A coral that had once been given to our child, born in our first years of marriage. No one, not even Mrs. Poole, not even that fool of her brother Mason, ever knew of our child. She conceived when we had moved away from her family. We had settled first near their family home in Jamaica, and I came to find them so unbearable. I could see we would have no domestic harmony while they were an influencer nearby. Therefore, I took a house on the far side of the island, on one of the plantations that came with her dowry, and for the 2 years we lived there with none of her family to interfere with us, we were all in all to each other. I was ecstatic when she told me we were to have a child, and I do believe that I attended to her as well as any woman could have wished. I was eager to ensure she had all she desired in good food, in soft clothing, in a comfortable environment, and in careful nursing when the birth was at hand. The birth was not an easy one. Little Clara arrived after many hours of painful labour, and my wife was quite drained by the process. Perhaps because of the birth, the child cried unwontedly. She was a pale, pretty-featured scrap, but stubborn and ill-natured with it, and she would not feed. We hired wet nurse after wet nurse. Bertha, formerly so comely, so readily at ease with life, became shrill and distraught. I have heard since that childbirth can send a woman mad, but at the time I was on my own in a foreign country with no one to consult. The child was fretful and wasting, and alongside the child, Bertha wasted too. Hers is a superstitious race. She began to declare that the child was not her own, but a witch child planted in the nursery. Her own sweet, healthy baby had been stolen, she averred, and it was true there was something elfin about the child's form and face. Even a sane soul might have taken her for a sprite or a fairy child. Soon Bertha became so convinced of her own fantasy that she refused to see the child at all. I thought it best to establish the baby away from home, with the only nurse we had found from whom she would willingly feed. But for all this, Bertha did not recover. If anything, she became more frantic. She began to pace the room at night like a caged panther. Her weeping became histrionic. Often I found her wandering alone, wailing to the moon and stars, her nightwear drenched with sweat or dew, I couldn't tell. Increasingly, for all my greater size, I had to struggle to bring her home. Finally, in desperation, I arranged for us to sail for England, praying that the purer air and more temperate climate would act as a salve to my poor wife's wits. And, not having any clear notion what else to do with her, I left our babe behind with the fervent hope that one day she would join us. For a while, my wife continued in her wild and unpredictable moods, but gradually, with kindly care and the changed circumstance, the fantasy of the changeling child seemed to recede. One day, quite humbly, she asked for Clara by name, and I had to explain that we had left her in Jamaica, assuring her, nevertheless, that she was in the best hands. She begged tearfully for me to send at once for our child. But before I could arrange for the nurse to bring her to us, a message came to say that little Clara had died of the swamp fever. From that day, my wife's madness returned. At first, overwhelmed with grief, she let me approach her, and I had some hopes that our shared sorrow might act to revive our former love. But soon a persistent fury set in, most often directed against me for parting her from her babe, but also against herself for failing her as a mother. I consulted private physicians from London, discreet men who could be trusted to hold their tongues. They came to offer their diagnoses, but none of their medicines seemed to heal her. At first, I regularly visited my poor deranged wife in the quarters I had appointed for her care, but as time went on, she became a perpetual reproach, a memory of my error, not in marrying her, but in disposing of the child. She seemed a living testament that too savagely proclaimed my guilt, and I confess that in my weakness I turned away in horror of it. The message recounting Clara's death was accompanied by the coral that Bertha held in her hands the night of the fire. An offering, I think I said it seemed. But to what or whom? No god or fate had taken her child. It was I, Edward Rochester, alone who had done this thing. As I stood on the roof of the burning house, where I had kept my wife all but prisoner, from my inner mental flagration, a saving spark of insight was born. Bertha, I said. Bertha, forgive me. At that moment, I wanted nothing more than to be as we once were with our little child. She didn't speak a word, but stared into my eyes, and in the light of the flames licking upwards, I saw great tears run down the folds of her once handsome cheeks. To my dying day, I will never forget that countenance, which I had helped to ruin. Then she gestured, as if to thrust the coral at me. As I moved to receive it, she turned, the pathetic child's remembrance still clasped in her hands, ran swiftly to the edge of the parapet, and threw herself down. When Jane found me in Ferndean in retreat from my old life, she told me that she had come because at a moment of crisis, when another man was pressing her to let him make her his own, she had heard my voice calling her name. How could I tell her how devoutly I wished she had gone to India with her stern cousin St. John Rivers? The idea of marriage to her now revolted me. I pleaded my infirmities. She insisted they only made me dearer to her. I hinted at a lost virility, hoping that a natural delicacy would prevent her inquiring further. She smiled, as if she understood my embarrassment, and forgave me. Oh, the scourge of that forgiveness when it was not hers, but another's that I needed to soothe my fighting soul. No argument would deter Jane from her conviction we should marry and complete the folly that I had begun. Worn down by her persistence, I consented. What else could I do? She had held out against the idea of becoming my mistress. Now she held out against any idea she should not become my wife. It was she who urged the renewal of the vows that had been so dramatically interrupted. She who led me to the nearby church, where she had organised with the parson that the banns be done away with, having been read already before. Ah, that seeming slightness concealed an indomitable will. I have come to question many things as the years pass. For one thing, I question the truth of that moment when she claimed to hear me call. For if she had heard any name across the ether, it was not hers, I cried, yearning into the darkness, but that of my lost child. From the spark of insight that emerged phoenix-like in my last fatal encounter with Bertha, there grew the blinding certainty that loss of that little child had bred my infatuation with Jane. With her girlish body and elfin looks, she had come to seem to embody the daughter I might have had. And I see too, as my physical vision slowly recovers, that I was not alone in the misconception of my desire, for Jane would always have preferred me as I am now, maimed, under her control. In my full health and strength, I was too much a match for her. Enfeebled and disillusioned and guilt-ridden as I am, she will always hold the upper hand. With a hazily restored sight of my one eye, I observe her nightly at her desk, where she sits writing furiously. She tells me she is writing an account of her life, and I have every confidence that she will turn our story as her will would have it. Myself, herself, my saviour, her fierce morality, triumphant, a truly righteous, heroic love, conquering all. Which is why I have seen fit to write down my own version of events, in the hope that some future reader might ponder an alternative. I have as little expectation of this ever being published as I am certain my young wife's account will be. Already she has written to publishers under the name John Elton. As I have come to see from her history, the force of her conviction is of a metal that no man can easily withstand. For this account, I hide behind no pseudonym, nor do I imagine I have any prospect of being published. It is for poor Bertha's sake, and in memory of little Clara, that I write this down, in order that there be somewhere some truthful record of what they came to mean to me. When I die, I shall entrust the account to my foster child, Adele, along with Clara's coral, which I found so charred in the ashy remains of Thornfield that no one but myself will see what it had once been.
Well, we've heard three remarkable and very varied readings. I'm sorry if I misled you about Lionel, but you certainly didn't disappoint us. You left us at the cusp of a very tantalising meeting. We've just got time for maybe a couple of questions if anyone's burning to ask a question. Don't feel inhibited. You have the opportunity. We have 2 mics in the audience. They're raring to go. Put up your hand and we'll get a mic to you. Who'd like to ask a question?
Perhaps I misunderstand your usage of the word delivered, but I did deliver a speech on this, and I'm a little disconcerted why anyone in this other event would object having not heard it delivered. I mean, it wasn't broadcast online. Only the text is online. So the literal delivery was only available to about 200 or 300 people in Brisbane, Australia. In terms of the way the piece is written, I'm sure that any point can always be put a little better, but I did the best I could. I don't know whether you've all followed this discussion. I haven't followed most of it, but there was a big hoo-ha on social media and a lot of mainstream press around this speech in a rather obscure literary festival. And I simply took on the recently popular concept of cultural appropriation, which is really hailing from American liberal arts colleges, which claims that we shouldn't take practices, beliefs, experience, costumes from other cultures without permission, and it's a little obscure how we're supposed to get the permission, which is one of the things I addressed. And I counter that, especially as it applies to fiction writing, I think this is wrong-headed, that for us to try to inhabit each other's experiences is a lot of what fiction writing is about. And one of the purposes of fiction is to try to put yourself in other people's shoes and try to understand other people's experience. And if we say that you can't do that anymore, then you don't have fiction. All you've really got is autobiography. And I personally am very bored with my life. And I don't only want to write autobiography. So, you know, I certainly didn't mean to stir up what this stirred up, but I think maybe we're getting to have an interesting discussion as a consequence. So I don't feel badly about having given that address.
Thank you very much. Well, Elif and Sarah, do you want to comment on that? Or do you want me to ask for another question?
I'd love to say a few words.
Okay,
if I may.
Elif, okay.
Because coming from Turkey, it's a question that I find very relevant. It resonates with me, what you said. For us, when you come from, the West, and then there's the non-West, there's the rest. And when you come from the rest as an author, you're very much associated with an identity, reduced to an identity. So let's say if you happen to be, particularly for women writers, this works. If you happen to come from the Muslim land, let's say, you are expected to tell the stories of Muslim women, and preferably sad stories about Muslim women. And I've always been very much bothered by that identity politics, In one book I might write about a Turkish woman, in another book I might write about someone completely different. As long as I can imagine, as long as I can put myself, in the shoes of that person, feel that person's experience, we can write about anything and everything. For me, fiction is not necessarily about telling my story to the world. I think that is incredibly boring and repetitive, monotonous. What is far more interesting is not to be myself. That's why I like fiction so much. I can be someone else and then someone else. And to look at the same story from that person's perspective, that is a beautiful, not only an intellectual, but also spiritual journey. So I also very much share what Virginia Woolf once upon a time used to say, our pen needs to be bisexual. We have both masculine and feminine energy inside us. Doesn't matter whether at first glance I have a certain identity, a description of an identity inside. That's why we like fiction so much. We have multiple selves and we can bring all of them out.
Thank you very much for that. Thanks for that very eloquent answer. Now, Sally, I'm sure.
Yeah, I'm just going to add to that. I actually had a letter in The Guardian in response to a comment made by Jonathan Franzen, who was challenged by a journalist. And I feel sorry for him because, you get challenged by journalists in the middle of an interview and you say things without thought. And the journalist in question asked why he'd never written about a black character. And he said, I think rather foolishly, I have to love my characters, and I've never been in love with a black woman, which is why I can't write about black characters. And so I, again, rather unfairly from my point of view, I wrote and said, well, if you follow that rule, then it suggests that Shakespeare can only write Macbeth if he's committed a murder. And the whole, I'm in full agreement with both the other speakers that the whole purpose of fiction, it seems to me, is to enable us to enter into other sensibilities and to try to comprehend otherness. And I think that's one of the reasons that it's important to read fiction as well as writing fiction. And if there are boundaries set, if a sort of Brexit is set up where we can't have immigrants from other cultures coming in, then it's going to impoverish our cultural imagination as much as Brexit's going to impoverish our social imagination, I think. So.